Hello, hello. My name is Austen, and this is the first part in a multi-part video series that's going to summarize Carl Olof Jonsson's work, The Gentile Times Reconsidered. If you have heard of his book but haven't read it, I highly encourage you to read it. It's available online in PDF form for free. You can also get it for Kindle and a print edition on Amazon. I believe that it was recently republished by Carl Olof Jonsson's research companion, Ruud Persson. So if you'd like to support him and his work, definitely buy the book. This video is only meant to summarize the basic thrust of his arguments, some of the evidence that he puts forth in his work. But if you're going to get the full weight of his arguments and evidence, you'll need to refer to all of the references in his work and everything that he has to say in his work. But all that being said, let's get into it. Okay, so to understand the importance of Jonsson's work to the XJW community, we have to understand the role that chronology plays in witness belief. Jehovah's Witnesses teach that God's kingdom was established in heaven, invisibly, in 1914. In fact, early October 1914. We're going to set aside for the moment the question of how Jehovah's Witnesses arrive at that date, but first we're going to ask the question that Jonsson starts to ask in the beginning of his book. Why is that date so significant, so important for witness doctrine? I'm actually going to give you some of my own reasons why I think it's important. They tend to run in parallel with some of the points that Carl Olof Jonsson makes in his book, but witness perspectives on these questions have shifted slightly since this book was written during the 70s and early 80s. Okay, so reason one is the eschatological timeline. This plays into two aspects of witness beliefs that play into identity and urgency. By the way, I know that witnesses do not normally use the word eschatology or eschatological. Perhaps some of you in the ex-witness community are not familiar with the word. It simply refers to last things. It is a way of talking about how a system of thought thinks about the future. Jehovah's Witnesses believe that all humans in rebellion against God will soon be physically destroyed by God's kingdom, along with all human governments and institutions in the not-too-distant future. And they believe that this is what the book of Revelation refers to as Armageddon. The establishment of God's kingdom in 1914 marks the beginning of a window of opportunity for individuals to be rescued from this coming calamity by aligning themselves with God's kingdom. They teach this period is referred to in the Bible as the last days. When Jehovah's Witnesses preach publicly, they knock on doors, they set up their carts in public spaces. They believe that this serves as both a warning and a message of hope for those who are a part of a world that is slated for destruction very soon. Therefore, there's an urgency to their work. This also forms a deep sense of their identity and their purpose, both as individuals and when witnesses think about themselves on a corporate level. Okay, reason number two plays into the witnesses' sense of identity, their sense of being selected by God, and witnesses tie this in actually to a specific date as well that runs in tight correlation with 1914. They believe that after God's kingdom was established in 1914, Jesus surveyed various Christian denominations and groups and selected Joseph F. Rutherford and his associates as the faithful and discreet slave that's mentioned in Matthew chapter 24. They would now comprise the only entity that would faithfully distribute spiritual food or teaching essential to salvation, essential to being rescued from the end of this world. How they arrive at 1919 we can discuss perhaps at another time, But what's important to know now is, like I said, 1919 is dependent upon the date 1914. And it is associated with the exclusivity claims that Jehovah's Witnesses still make to this day. And last reason number 3, this generation. This refers to a teaching that perhaps all or most of ex-witnesses have thought about or talked about in the process of their deconstruction. It refers to the belief that is associated with a admittedly obscure expression from Jesus in Matthew chapter 24, where he says, "This generation will by no means pass away until all these things happen." Jehovah's Witnesses believe that this means a generation of Spirit-anointed Christians who would be alive in the beginning of the last days and would perceive that 1914 was the beginning of the last days and that God's kingdom was established and that that generation would not die out before the Great Tribulation came. This teaching was especially emphasized during the 1980s when the 1914 generation was starting to die off, and it was deployed to create an even greater sense of urgency for faithful witnesses. In the 1990s, it became clear that the original generation who was alive during 1914 wouldn't live to see the Great Tribulation. And so this teaching underwent several revisions until the release of the July 2013 issue of the Watchtower. Since the publication of that issue, it's been an official teaching of Jehovah's Witnesses that this generation that would not pass away until all these things happen refers to an overlapping generation. That is, two groups of contemporary Spirit-anointed Christians who would make up the generation that Jesus was referring to. How they arrive at this teaching, you can read in that issue of the Watchtower and in plenty of other resources that have been put out. But for the purposes of this video, the important thing to remember is that Jehovah's Witnesses believe that our distance in time from the date 1914, the further away we get from that year, the closer we are getting to Armageddon. And there's an urgency created by the bubble of time that is created by this generation, in particular the second group. The time that they are going to be alive is shrinking, and the implication is that that means we are getting closer and closer to the end. Identity, urgency, and purpose are deeply intertwined with the 1914 date for Jehovah's Witnesses. And as Jonsson points out in his book, they've even associated that date with the gospel message itself, the core message of Jehovah's Witnesses. Here's a quote from the 1981 May 1st issue of the Watchtower. Here's what it says. "Let the honest-hearted person compare the kind of preaching of the gospel of the kingdom done by the religious systems of Christendom during all the centuries with that done by Jehovah's Witnesses since the end of World War I in 1918. They are not one and the same kind. That of Jehovah's Witnesses is really gospel or good news, as of God's heavenly kingdom that was established by the enthronement of his Son Jesus Christ at the end of the Gentile times in 1914. Today, Jehovah's Witnesses that you might have conversations with may try to downplay the role that the 1914 date has in their doctrinal system. But because, as we've seen, their sense of identity, urgency, and purpose are deeply connected to their beliefs about 1914, they cannot dispose of the date, even though they may want to distance themselves from 1914. Witnesses still regularly state in their literature and in public discourses intended for the public that Bible chronology indicates that God's kingdom was established in 1914. So, how do Jehovah's Witnesses arrive at the 1914 date? Well, I'm going to explain their process and the reasoning behind the process, but be prepared, this is not going to make complete sense. That's okay. We just need to understand where the ideas come from. When Jehovah's Witnesses explain this doctrine, they're going to refer to Daniel chapter 4. In this story, the king of Babylon has a dream about an enormous tree that ends up being chopped down, and the base of the tree is bounded. And a heavenly being declares that 7 times will pass over the tree, and then it's going to be unbounded and grow again. The tree that's being chopped down in the vision symbolizes the Davidic dynasty and rulership. It's God's former means of expressing his rule on earth. And this was removed when Jerusalem was destroyed by the Babylonians. Jehovah's Witnesses believe that this event occurred in the year 607 BCE. This is obviously going to be important later, and this is really the crux of what Carl Olof Jonsson is going to talk about in his book. So, what were the 7 times that would pass over the tree? The dream seems to indicate that God's rulership would re-emerge after 7 times. So, how long is 7 times? What is a time exactly? Well, to figure that out, you have to go to the book of Revelation in the New Testament. At least that's where C.T. Russell is going to take the Bible students. And this is the formula that Jehovah's Witnesses use to solve this puzzle. If you go to Revelation chapter 12, it associates the figure of 3.5 times. It actually says a time, times, and half a time, which probably does mean 3.5 times. And it associates that number with 1,260 days. So if you want to figure out what 7 times means in Daniel chapter 4, you just double the 3.5 times from Revelation. And the 3.5 times from Revelation, again, are 1,260 days, so 1,260 days becomes 2,520 days. So that period of 7 times from Daniel chapter 4, in which the tree of God's rulership is chopped down, is 2,520 days. And after that time elapses, God's appointed ruler will rule again, right? Well, if you start from the destruction of Jerusalem by the Babylonians, which, as we mentioned, Jehovah's Witnesses believe was in 607, and you move forward 2,520 literal days, you get to 600 BCE, and nothing happens, really. Nothing significant happens in connection with this idea of God's rulership being manifested by a specific ruler. Well, what if those days are not actually days? What if they were actually years? And as Jonsson points out, many people have thought that those days could actually be years. And there's a reason for this. If you go to the book of Numbers, when God is judging the Israelites for their disobedience in the wilderness, he sentences them with a formula. A day for a year. A day for a year. This same formula is used in the book of Ezekiel to pronounce judgment over Jerusalem. So witnesses, and in fact others, have seen this and believe that this pronouncement was not just a way that God sentenced Israel at that time, but this represents something of a general formula, a principle that can be used to interpret all time prophecies in the Bible. So, like that, 2,520 days becomes 2,520 years. If you count from the witness date of the destruction of Jerusalem, that is October 607 BCE, and you add 2,520 years, you arrive at October 1914. Now, this can all seem convoluted, and it is convoluted, but you can see why this is also in some sense impressive. This formula seems to harmonize a lot of biblical data into a single internally coherent system. And as we'll see in the next video, this way of harmonizing scripture to make sense of prophecy isn't unique to Jehovah's Witnesses. In the introduction to the Gentile Times Reconsidered, Jonsson shares a little bit about his personal journey, how he, as a pioneer and elder, was challenged to prove to a Bible student that Jerusalem was destroyed in 607, and how that turned out to be an inciting incident in his journey that led on a collision course with the organization. I'll leave you to read his story in the introduction to his book, but next time we're going to summarize Jonsson's excursus on the history of prophetic interpretation and how various figures and groups leading up to Charles Taze Russell would use prophetic texts and apply them to chronology and ultimately eschatological speculation.